It was 6:00 a.m. The service for my father was set to begin in just 4 hours, and that was the moment they arrived, wielding sledgehammers. Crack, crack, crack. The chicken coop I had built with my own hands. In a mere 12 minutes, they demolished what had served as 3 months of therapeutic work following my wife's passing. Shards of fresh cedar would mingled with the morning dew while my frightened chickens fled in every direction across the lawn. The air became thick with the scent of sawdust and the aroma of crushed marigolds from the garden I had planted in my wife's memory. It was the HOA president. She shared pictures of the destruction on Facebook, complete with laughing emojis. She described it as a lesson for those who don't belong. But what she was unaware of, what no one realized, was the presence of a 60-year-old drainage valve. Located 6 feet under the ground where I stood, a single, rusted handle governed the water supply to their prized $5 million resort lake. This was the very lake that sustained the inflated property values of 347 homes. The very same body of water that caused their sprawling McMansions to be valued at 3 times their purchase price. A single turn, 48 hours, nothing but mudflats. How would you react if your HOA did this on the day of your parents' funeral? Let me know your location, because I can assure you that your own HOA has engaged in similar despicable behavior. My name is Jasper Crawford. Jazz to those who are important to me, and just 6 months prior, I believed I understood the full extent of my predicament, a third-generation electrician, a recent widower, and the caregiver for a father who mistakenly calls me Tommy half the time, because dementia is a true son of a... I came into possession of 2 acres in Willowbrook Estates from my grandmother back in 2019. Now, Willowbrook is the type of community where residents allocate more money to lawn maintenance than many people earn in a month. It features McMansions valued at $800,000, HOA fees substantial enough to finance a small nation, and neighbors who literally measure your grass with rulers. What made my land unique, and I use that word reservedly, is that it is situated at the natural lowest point of the whole development. Every bit of rainfall, every misdirected sprinkler spray, and the outflow from every storm drain for 347 houses ultimately passes through my property on its way to Willowbrook Resort Lake. That $5 million centerpiece where Instagram models strike poses and tech entrepreneurs host their nuptials. Following the death of my wife, Sarah, from cancer, I constructed a chicken coop, not because I had adopted a rural lifestyle, but because grief compels you to do strange things, and driving nails felt more constructive than downing whiskey. I dedicated 3 months to hand-picking each cedar plank. I erected it on the exact spot where my grandmother's chickens had resided since 1959. The scent of new pine shavings and the sound of Henrietta pecking at her morning feed kept me grounded when everything else seemed to be collapsing. What I was oblivious to was that 6 feet below my feet, my grandmother had bequeathed me the most valuable inheritance imaginable. Hidden within her basement archives, I had discovered an enigmatic note: emergency drainage controls for wet seasons, annual valve storm system connection. I had dismissed it as antiquated farming jargon. As it happened, that jargon governed 73% of the water flow to the community's cherished lake. Now, let's introduce our antagonist, Delilah Thornfield, the HOA board president and a professional nuisance. She is 48, blonde, and operates a white Range Rover with a license plate that reads, Harain. Because tact apparently died along with shame, it seems she relocated here 5 years ago, wedded to Preston, who conveniently heads the development firm that is considering a lake expansion. Delilah is the kind of person who wears Louboutins to retrieve her mail and has never faced a challenge she couldn't resolve by demanding to speak to a manager. The violation notice came on a Tuesday, as sharp as freshly printed malice. Unauthorized agricultural structure, $500 fine, increasing by $100 per day until removed. I tried to call and clarify. Grief therapy, a recent loss. Do you know what this supposedly compassionate community leader responded? Mr. Crawford, grief is not an exemption from community standards. I can still feel the texture of that letter as it crumpled in my calloused work hands, the way Delilah's polished voice sliced through the phone like shattered glass. In that moment, standing beside my therapeutic chicken coop as my father, upstairs, forgot who I was, a resolve hardened within me. I submitted a request for a variance hearing, which was denied without consideration. I asked for mediation, but it was deemed not necessary. A 30-day extension? Absolutely not. You see, the reality of Willowbrook Estates is that it is all built upon a fragile foundation of property values. That resort lake ensures that 347 homes are worth twice what their owners paid. It supports wedding venue reservations, fishing competitions, and those sunset paddleboard yoga classes that affluent women post on Instagram. Take away the lake, and property values plummet by 40% in a single night. My humble ranch house stands among these tributes to mortgage debt like a blue-collar middle finger, making it an obvious target, and targets, as we know, often end up being eliminated. I ended the call and observed Henrietta pursuing a grasshopper in the yard. The morning breeze carried the fragrance of new cedar and the distinct smell of lake water right after dawn. Clean, full of promise, and valuable. What Delilah was unaware of, what no one knew, was that my seemingly worthless slice of heaven was equipped with a kill switch, a single rusty valve handle that had the power to transform their $5 million lake into the most expensive mud puddle in the world. But first, I had to determine if I possessed the courage to use it. 3 days later, my mailbox yielded a legal explosive disguised as a certified letter. Thornfield and Associates Legal Services. Because, naturally, our HOA president operates her own law firm. Nothing conveys fairness and impartiality quite like being the judge, jury, and executioner. All in one immaculately polished package, the paper felt costly in my hands. That thick stock attorneys use to let you know you're on the verge of being financially assaulted. Notice of legal action, immediate, cessation required. It listed 3 separate covenant infractions, $2,000 in administrative charges, and a 72-hour countdown that commenced while my father was in hospice care, calling out for his long-dead mother. However, Delilah committed her first amateur error. The photos of the violation were taken from my neighbor's property. I could discern this from the angle and the fence post visible in the corner, a sort of photographic admission of guilt. After 20 years in electrical work, I had learned that solid documentation always triumphs over intimidation. That weekend, I set up 4 security cameras complete with night vision. It cost me $800 I didn't really have, but my grandfather always said, "Knowledge is expensive, but ignorance costs everything." It turns out the old man was right about more than just cards. While installing the camera cables, I took the time to investigate HOA covenant law. After 3 hours of sifting through county regulations so tedious they could cure sleeplessness, I found it. Pure gold buried in the bureaucratic jargon, Delilah had never submitted the proper amendments to the county. Her restrictions on agriculture were legally invalid without the approval of the county planning department. I had encountered this very error on commercial projects where contractors attempted to bypass permit requirements. The true prize, however, was located in my grandma's basement files, tucked between 4 decades of seed catalogs and fertilizer invoices. The original 1959 property survey, it smelled as musty as a crypt but was twice as precious. My chicken coop was situated on the precise footprint of my grandmother's original henhouse, which predated the HOA's existence by 37 years. It was a grandfathered agricultural use. As legal as apple pie and doubly American, I submitted a counterclaim, asserting continuous agricultural use since the Eisenhower administration. The scent of old ink and aged paper blended with the profound satisfaction of seeing legal bullies gag on their own procedural missteps. Then, my cameras captured footage that made my morning coffee taste like triumph. At 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, a motion alert vibrated on my phone like an incensed hornet. There was Preston Thornfield, Delilah's husband from the development company, skulking around my property with professional-grade surveying gear. The infrared video showed him as a ghostly white figure in the darkness, measuring distances and snapping pictures as if he were preparing to construct a shopping center. 43 minutes of trespassing were recorded in high definition, but here's the crucial detail. I knew that equipment from my electrical work on construction sites. Preston wasn't just harassing me for sport. This was pre-development reconnaissance, the kind of survey conducted before submitting permit applications. The following morning, I found myself at the county planning office, immersed in public records that reeked of bureaucracy and unfulfilled dreams. After 45 minutes of paper cuts and tired eyes, I hit pay dirt. Preliminary development applications for Willowbrook Resort Phase 2 had been filed by Preston's firm. The planned expansion necessitated an access easement that crossed my land. My supposedly worthless 2 acres were located at the ideal drainage point for their new resort phase. They couldn't afford to purchase my property at its fair market value, so their strategy was to force me out with HOA harassment and then acquire my land at a foreclosure auction for a fraction of its worth. It was clever, malicious, and on the brink of backfiring spectacularly. That afternoon, Delilah called, her voice having the tone of a kindergarten teacher on the verge of losing her patience. "Mr. Crawford, we've looked over your county filing. Very astute. However, the board has approved the immediate removal of your structure if you fail to comply voluntarily." "Meaning what exactly?" I asked. "A contractor is on standby. Your deadline is noon tomorrow." The line went dead with a click that sounded like a coffin closing. I remained seated, holding the phone, the dial tone buzzing in my ear like electronic mockery. But another thought was buzzing in my mind, connecting pieces I hadn't seen before. My property wasn't just at the geographic low point of the neighborhood. It was the central drainage control point for the entire development, and somewhere in my grandma's basement. Files, I had seen mentions of emergency drainage controls and manual valve systems. That evening, I stood on my back porch, observing Henrietta Chase grasshoppers as the sunset transformed the lake into molten gold. The air smelled of fresh cedar from my coop and that clean scent of lake water after dusk, as tranquil as a Norman Rockwell scene. But beneath my feet, 6 feet down in the darkness, something was waiting. Some piece of 1960s infrastructure that my grandmother had managed for 60 years, and if Preston coveted my land so much that he would resort to trespassing and fraud to obtain it, perhaps that hidden secret was far more valuable than I had ever guessed. Tomorrow, Delilah would discover the consequences of threatening a man with nothing left to lose. Delilah's deadline passed like a fart in church. Loud, awkward, and ultimately inconsequential. At noon on Tuesday, I was on my porch sipping sweet tea, observing 3 contractors in hard hats wander around my chicken coop like bewildered tourists. It seems that grandfathered agricultural rights carry more weight than HOA legal notices, but victory often makes one's adversaries desperate, and desperate individuals are prone to stupid, vengeful actions. On Thursday evening, my phone lit up with notifications that made my stomach churn as if I'd swallowed shattered glass. Emergency HOA meeting Friday night. Agenda: addressing health and safety hazards in Willowbrook Estates. Every homeowner received the notice but me. A minor omission I learned about when my neighbor Janet texted to ask if I was suffering from some rare chicken-borne illness. On Friday at 7:00 p.m., while I was wrist-deep in a restaurant's electrical panel that stank of grease and despair, Delilah conducted her sham trial. 30 neighbors crowded into the clubhouse to view a PowerPoint presentation that would have made Joseph Goebbels beam with pride. "Chickens attract rats," she declared, advancing through slides of my hens as if they were exhibits in a capital case. "Rats carry disease. Disease affects property values. This agricultural operation presents a direct financial danger to our community." The argument was flawless if one disregarded science, zoning regulations, and basic human decency, but fear is a more effective sales tool than facts, particularly when those facts could cost you $50,000 in home equity. The board voted 4-1 to authorize immediate hazard removal within 48 hours. They even granted themselves the right to trespass on my land for the sake of community safety. Because nothing says safety like breaking and entering with power tools. I learned all of this from Janet's husband, Mark, who recorded the entire spectacle on his phone. Watching the footage later, seeing Delilah's practiced smile as she publicly destroyed my reputation in high definition, something cold and methodical solidified in my chest. 2 could engage in the game of public opinion. I had created a Facebook group named Willowbrook Property Rights. Immediately after her first legal threat, I posted old photos showing our neighborhood as functional farmland, shared the footage of Preston's midnight trespassing, and recounted my story of HOA harassment during a family crisis. Within a week, 87 neighbors had joined, contributing their own stories of Delilah's tyrannical rule. Margaret Chen faced a $3,000 fine for parking her disabled son's wheelchair-accessible van in her own driveway for too many consecutive days. Bill Rodriguez received violations for growing tomatoes in raised beds smaller than most flower pots. The Hendersons were threatened with legal action for installing a wheelchair ramp without the architectural committee's consent. Recognizing the pattern wasn't difficult, Delilah targeted anyone who disturbed her suburban ideal. Disabled access, ethnic gardens, working-class vehicles, and grief therapy chickens were all threats to the immaculate aesthetic that kept property values ascending to the heavens. But Facebook was merely the warm-up. The main event was Heritage Day, a neighborhood potluck that featured fresh eggs from my supposedly disease-ridden hens, 63 neighbors attended on Sunday afternoon, sharing anecdotes about the area's agricultural past, while their children gathered warm eggs and fed Henrietta directly from their hands. The aroma of charcoal and fresh corn mingled with the laughter of children and the sound of hens clucking peacefully in their enclosure. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, my property felt vibrant with purpose rather than tainted by conflict. It was then that Margaret Chun revealed the information that altered everything. "Jazz?" she whispered, pulling me aside near the vegetable garden Sarah never had the chance to complete. "I used to work in real estate title research. I checked Delilah's business filings." She glanced around as if we were orchestrating a bank robbery. "Her firm is representing the resort developers. She's been receiving pre-sale commissions on Phase 2. Every piece of the puzzle fell into place with the satisfying click of a perfectly aligned joint. Delilah wasn't simply enforcing community standards. She was clearing out inventory for a massive payday that would make her wealthy enough to purchase her own private lake. But Margaret had saved the most crucial information for last. While sifting through property records, she had discovered something that made my grandmother's old farming notes suddenly significant. Original 1962 county drainage. Maps that identified my property as the manual flood control point for the entire development. That night, equipped with a flashlight and my grandfather's shovel, I embarked on a treasure hunt in my own basement. After 2 hours of digging through soil that smelled of decades of buried secrets, my shovel struck metal 6 feet down. Wrapped in oiled canvas like a pirate's bounty, was a valve well attached to a pipe as thick as my forearm. The metal felt cold and rough through my work gloves, but it turned with the smoothness of silk when I gave it a slight quarter rotation. 20 minutes later, the retention pond behind my property had lowered by 2 inches. I gazed at that valve wheel in the flashlight's beam, and a chilling understanding washed over me. My therapeutic chicken coop wasn't just built on any ordinary piece of land. It was positioned directly over the drainage control system for 347 homes and a $5 million lake. Delilah wanted a fight. I was sitting on the very chessboard. Monday morning felt like a bureaucratic doomsday, delivered by certified mail. My phone began to ring at 6:00 a.m., with violation reports that seemed like the delirious fantasies of a suburban despot with an excess of time and a deficit of therapy. Violation number 1. Unsightly commercial vehicle disrupting residential aesthetic. This referred to my work truck, the same Ford F-150 that had resolved electrical issues for half the neighborhood, including Delilah's garage door opener last Christmas. Violation number 2. Excessive noise disturbance during designated quiet hours. This was about the backup alarm that beeped for a total of 12 seconds as I backed out of my own driveway. Evidently, my truck's safety features were now considered crimes against humanity. Violation number 3. Unauthorized frequent visitors creating parking congestion. This was aimed at the hospice nurses who were caring for my dying father, because nothing embodies community values quite like harassing medical staff during a family emergency. By Friday, I had amassed 12 violations, like collecting cursed Pokemon cards. The total fines amounted to $8,400 and were increasing more rapidly than gas prices. Each notice was delivered with the sharp efficiency of a paper cut intended to drain my bank account. But Delilah's crowning achievement was violation number 12, disturbing community peace through excessive emotional displays. In other words, weeping at my father's bedside was now an HOA violation because it made joggers uncomfortable during their morning self-righteousness runs. The scent of antiseptic and impending death permeated my father's hospice room as I read legal threats stating that my grief was a violation of municipal code. If Satan were to manage a homeowners association, Delilah would be his prize student. But this is what occurs when you push a man who has already lost everything into a corner. He ceases to play defense and begins to search for weapons. My Facebook group had grown to 200 members following Heritage Day. Each violation notice I shared ignited more fury than a bad call from a referee at the Super Bowl. The comments section transformed into a support group for HOA survivors who shared their own war stories that made my chicken coop issue seem like a minor parking infraction. Then, Rebecca Martinez from Channel 7's On Your Side contacted me. She had been observing our social media uproar and sensed a story that was ratings gold wrapped in righteous indignation. A widowed electrician being harassed during a family tragedy. That was journalistic catnip. The television crew came on Wednesday afternoon, with cameras rolling as Rebecca interviewed me beside Henrietta's coop. The late afternoon sun illuminated the cedar planks that Sarah had helped me choose, casting a warm, golden glow against the green backdrop of my therapeutic garden. 6 neighbors gave on-camera testimonies about their own experiences with Delilah's petty despotism, but the irrefutable evidence was the footage of Preston's midnight trespassing. High-definition infrared video of a development executive surveying private land with professional gear. That's the kind of proof that makes news directors giddy with excitement. The segment was broadcast on Friday at 6:00 p.m. under the headline, Grieving Widower Targeted by HOA During Family Crisis. It featured footage of my father's empty wheelchair and the violation notices piled on my kitchen table, followed by a slow zoom on Delilah's lakefront mansion. It was pure cinematic storytelling that spread faster than a TikTok dance. Local Reddit threads erupted, and Facebook groups shared it across 3 counties. The comments section became a virtual mob with pitchforks, demanding Delilah's head on a spike fashioned from HOA bylaws. But the true turning point came from an unexpected quarter. Dr. Sarah Chan, Margaret's sister and an environmental scientist at the State University, got in touch with me after the broadcast. She had picked up on my casual remark about controlling the neighborhood drainage and wanted to know more about my property's function in the local watershed. People don't grasp how suburban development puts stress on natural water systems. She explained over a coffee that tasted of academic curiosity and revolutionary potential. When you change farmland into housing, you are essentially rerouting how water moves across the land. Her maps resembled anatomical charts, illustrating how storm runoff from 347 roofs was funneled through underground channels toward the resort lake. An individual with access to the original manual valve system could, in theory, manage the water flow for the entire development. My coffee suddenly tasted like liquid power. That weekend, I undertook my own investigation with the meticulousness of a man who had at last found his mission. I made quarter-turn adjustments to the valve, documenting the results with time-lapse photography that showed the retention pond levels decreasing like a drunk man's inhibitions. A half-turn completely emptied the decorative fountain at the clubhouse. By Sunday, I comprehended the full extent of my inheritance. My grandmother hadn't just left me 2 acres. She had left me the ability to control the economic vitality of Willowbrook Estates. Monday brought the confirmation I had been seeking. The resort management scheduled an emergency board meeting. Wedding cancellations were piling up and negative reviews cited community instability. The bad press was costing them real money, the kind that makes wealthy people anxious and working people grin. Delilah's reaction was, predictably, unhinged. She employed a private investigator to track my every move, document every dandelion on my lawn, and photograph my visitors as if I were managing a drug operation instead of grieving for my father. But desperation leads to foolishness. On Thursday night, my cameras recorded 3 contractor trucks parked outside my house like mechanical buzzards. My father passed away on Tuesday morning. The funeral was scheduled for Friday at 10:00 a.m. Delilah's scheme was sophisticated in its cruelty. Destroy the evidence while I was burying my father. She had no inkling of what lay 6 feet beneath my feet. On Friday morning at 6:00 a.m., for hours before my father's funeral, I stood in my bathrobe as 3 men with sledgehammers turned my grief therapy into splinters. Their cameras recording as if it were some sick reality show. Crack, crack, crack. 3 months of healing were undone in 12 minutes. The scent of fresh cedar mingled with Henrietta's frantic squawks as she and her sisters fled like feathered refugees across my yard. My security cameras documented every unlawful swing, every trespassing step, and every violation of property rights that would make the founding fathers turn in their graves. But being at rock bottom has its benefits. It provides a solid base from which to build something formidable. While Delilah's demolition team made my property look like a construction site had violently collided with a tornado, I was in my basement, sifting through my grandmother's documents with the intense focus of a man who had finally discovered his purpose. The 1962 correspondence with the County Flood Control Department was not just bureaucratic red tape. It was a legal superweapon disguised as mundane government letters. Page after page detailed negotiations between Grandma Crawford and county engineers, establishing what they termed perpetual easement rights for manual flood control maintenance. The prose was as dry as old toast, but its implications were staggering. The county had paid my grandmother $500 a year until 1987 to maintain the active flood control infrastructure. The payments ceased when some bureaucrat deemed the system outdated. but the legal rights were automatically transferred to the property's heirs. That meant me, with my hands still trembling from grief and fury, I contacted the county engineering department. Rosa Martinez, the current water systems engineer, sounded like the kind of person who meticulously reads the fine print in government agreements. "Mr. Crawford," she stated, the rustling of papers audible through the phone. "According to our files, your family has held flood control easement rights since 1962. The original contract overrides any HOA covenants, municipal laws, or private restrictions. In plain English, Delilah's HOA could kiss my legally protected rear, but Rosa's next disclosure made my coffee taste like sweet revenge. That valve system manages approximately 73% of the water intake for the resort lake. A full closure would cause the lake level to drop 8 to 12 feet within 1 week, depending on the amount of rainfall. I stared at the hole where my chicken coop had been, and a realization washed over me like a baptism by fire. Delilah hadn't just destroyed my therapeutic project. She had inadvertently started a war with the one individual who could transform her $5 million lakeside paradise into the world's most expensive mud pit. The engineering maps Rosa sent me via email provided the full picture in stunning, frightening detail: storm drains from 347 homes, 3 retention ponds, and 2 commercial developments, all channeled through underground conduits that my valve controlled with the precision of a cardiac surgeon's scalpel. Closing that valve would turn the resort's immaculate beach into a mosquito-infested swamp visible from space. The dock where wedding parties posed for pictures would be left high and dry on the exposed lakebed, a monument to flawed planning. Property values would plummet faster than my prospects for a quiet retirement. 30 to 40% overnight, Delilah's development. Ambitions would become worthless paper, and Preston's Phase 2 expansion would be dead before it began. But here is the beautiful, terrifying reality. As the legal steward of the flood management infrastructure, I had the full right to operate that valve. No permits were needed, no HOA consent was required, and there was no legal recourse for anyone impacted by my maintenance activities. My grandmother had not just left me 2 acres and a broken heart. She had bequeathed me the power to either protect or ruin the financial future of an entire community. That afternoon, while Delilah was likely celebrating her demolition success with champagne and sociopathic satisfaction, I stood over my buried valve, fully comprehending the true meaning of leverage. She had aimed to destroy a grieving widower's last source of solace. Now, she was about to discover the consequences of declaring war on the man who controlled the water. By Saturday morning, my kitchen resembled a command center conceived by caffeine-fueled revolutionaries. Maps were spread across every available surface. Legal papers were piled like ammunition, and coffee stains marked key locations on my grandmother's old dining table, where 4 very different individuals were plotting the demise of a suburban despot. Marcus Webb, my newly retained legal counsel, had retired from environmental law at 61, but had re-entered the field faster than a fire horse. Upon hearing my story, he was tall, silver-haired, and had a quiet intensity that could make opposing lawyers break into a cold sweat. Marcus had moved to Willowbrook 3 months prior, specifically to avoid HOA conflicts. Life, it seems, has a sense of humor like a drunken stand-up comic. Rosa Martinez, the county engineer who had validated my valve rights, sat opposite him, examining watershed maps with the sharp precision of someone who understood that water flows downhill and bureaucracy flows uphill. She had given up her Saturday because, as she put it, "Delilah Thornfield has been a thorn in my department's side for 5 years. Tommy Tank Morrison rounded out our unlikely trio. A local contractor built like a refrigerator with a score to settle. Tank had his own issues with the HOA after they had fined him $2,000 for parking his work truck in his own driveway during community event weekends. He brought homemade donuts that tasted of justice and a practical understanding of how things are actually constructed in the real world. Eleanor Pratt, our clandestine weapon, was a 72-year-old retired county clerk who knew where every bureaucratic skeleton was interred. She appeared unannounced with 3 boxes of public records and a grin that implied she had been anticipating this moment her entire career. "Honey," Eleanor declared, laying out documents on my counter like tarot cards foretelling Delilah's downfall. "I've watched that woman exploit the system for years. It's time someone reminded her that the law applies to everyone, even HOA presidents with an inflated sense of self-importance." Marcus had spent Friday night scrutinizing my grandmother's easement papers with the meticulousness of a forensic accountant investigating the mafia. His conclusion was clear. My water rights were irrefutable, predating the HOA by decades, and completely unassailable in a court of law. Jasper, you don't just have the right to operate that valve, he clarified, his voice filled with the assurance of someone who had won far larger battles. You have a legal duty to maintain the flood control. Infrastructure, if anything, the HOA has been obstructing your federal easement responsibilities. Rosa had dedicated her weekend to creating professional engineering schematics that illustrated precisely what my valve controlled. Her maps resembled circulatory system diagrams for a mechanical heart, with my property as the vital ventricle that pumped life through Willowbrook's man-made ecosystem. A full closure would not violate any environmental laws, she confirmed, gesturing to flowcharts that made my head swim. The original system was engineered with manual override features for flood management. You would essentially be reverting the watershed to its state before development. Tank's contribution was more hands-on but just as crucial. He had set up what he called a neighborhood watch among the dozen contractors and blue-collar workers who had joined my Facebook group. They would maintain a rotating surveillance schedule to document any further harassment, threats, or property damage. These HOA types think working people won't stand up for themselves, Tank grumbled around a mouthful of glazed donut. It's time to show them what happens when you mess with someone who actually knows how to build things. Eleanor had been the most industrious of all. Her 3 boxes held property records for every HOA board member, uncovering conflicts of interest that would make an ethics professor despair. 2 other board members held stock in the development company. The treasurer's wife was employed by the same law firm that was handling the permits for Phase 2. The secretary's brother-in-law was the general contractor bidding on the resort expansion. This isn't just corruption, Eleanor stated with the satisfaction of someone who had been keeping a tally for years. This is a criminal conspiracy masked as community governance. Our plan took shape over the course of 6 hours and enough coffee to float a warship. Phase 1. Present my easement rights to the HOA, along with a formal demand to stop the harassment and provide full compensation for property damage. We would give them 72 hours to reply like reasonable adults. Phase 2. If they persisted with their campaign of harassment, we would demonstrate the valve's control with a minor adjustment, just enough to lower the lake level noticeably without causing lasting harm. Sometimes, you have to reveal your weapon before people take you seriously. Phase 3. Full media disclosure of the valve's capabilities and the board's corruption. We would let public pressure and negative press compel them to negotiate fair terms. Phase 4. If all else failed, legal action, with Marcus wielding environmental law like a chainsaw against their HOA covenants. The emergency option remained unspoken but was clearly understood. Full valve closure if they resorted to property destruction again. I had spent my Saturday realizing that I was no longer fighting this battle alone. Tank had connections throughout the blue-collar community. Rosa had allies in the county government. Marcus knew environmental lawyers across 3 states. Eleanor had compromising information on half the county commissioners. But most importantly, I had learned that knowledge truly is power, especially when that knowledge involves control over the very thing that prevents your enemy's property values from collapsing like a house of cards in a storm. On Sunday evening, I stood over my valve once more, fully aware of what Sunday morning would entail. Monday morning brought a campaign of psychological warfare disguised as community concern. Delilah had apparently dedicated her weekend to orchestrating a character assassination that would have impressed the KGB, had they specialized in suburban horror stories. Anonymous flyers appeared in every mailbox but mine, featuring my driver's license photo, clearly acquired through illicit means, alongside warnings about my deteriorating mental state following multiple family tragedies. The flyers insinuated that I had become a potential threat to the neighborhood's children and pets, and advised residents to keep a safe distance and report any suspicious activities. By Tuesday, fake online reviews began to surface about my electrical business. One-star tirades alleged that I had left homes in unsafe conditions and damaged property during installations. The reviews were obviously fabricated. Some mentioned work I had supposedly done in cities I had never even been to, and one criticized my unprofessional attitude during a job that took place while I was at my wife's funeral. But Delilah's piece de resistance was the phone calls to my commercial clients. 3 businesses terminated their contracts after receiving anonymous warnings about my lawsuit troubles and unstable personal situation. She was systematically dismantling my livelihood, while portraying herself as a concerned community leader safeguarding innocent families from a grieving madman. Wednesday's HOA board meeting featured a special safety discussion about residents who might pose a risk during periods of emotional crisis. My name was never mentioned, but the PowerPoint slides included images of my property, my truck, and security footage of me working in my yard. Delilah had weaponized my grief and turned it into a public safety concern. The smear campaign was as effective as a suburban wildfire. 3 neighbors who had previously been supportive began to avert their eyes. At the mailbox, parents guided their children away from my property as if I were harboring weapons-grade plutonium instead of mourning my father. But here's what happens when you corner a man who has already lost everything and has recently discovered he holds the nuclear option. You compel him to make some very risky choices. On Thursday night, I convened an emergency session of my war council. Marcus arrived with a briefcase filled with righteous legal fury. Rosa brought updated engineering data that made my valve's control seem even more formidable. Tank appeared with surveillance photos that would have made the FBI envious. Eleanor carried a file folder as thick as a phone book, crammed with evidence of HOA corruption that could bring down governments. She's trying to provoke you into doing something reckless, Marcus noted, examining the fake reviews on his laptop. It's a classic isolation tactic. Dismantle your support system, cut off your income, and then wait for you to break so she can justify her next move. Rosa's new data uncovered something that made my coffee taste like sweet revenge. Recent county assessments valued the Resort Lakes property tax at $47 million across all affected properties. A 12-foot drop in the water level would decrease that valuation by approximately $18 million, leading to tax assessment appeals that would occupy county resources for years. She's not just targeting you personally, Rosa explained, pointing to spreadsheets that looked like financial weapons. She's betting everything on the assumption that you're too civilized to use the power you possess. It was then that Tank revealed the information that changed everything. His surveillance team had been tracking Delilah's activities since the demolition, and they had discovered something that made her character assassination efforts seem like child's play. Jazz, she's planning to file a restraining order tomorrow morning, Tank declared, his voice heavy with the gravity of someone who had seen the legal documents. She claims you've made terrorist threats against the community, she says. You're planning to poison the water supply and destroy property values through environmental sabotage. The allegations were based entirely on fabricated witness statements from board members who had suddenly recalled threatening conversations that never occurred. The restraining order would bar me from attending HOA meetings, using community facilities, or even walking past certain properties. It would also obliterate any remaining credibility I had with potential clients. Eleanor's investigation had revealed the true motive behind Delilah's desperation. The Phase 2 development agreement had performance deadlines linked to property acquisition. If Preston's company failed to obtain my land by December 31st, they would lose their $500,000 development deposit and forfeit exclusive building rights worth millions. She's not just harassing you for sport, Eleanor clarified, adjusting her reading glasses with the precision of someone delivering a final verdict. She's facing financial ruin if this development deal falls through. That makes her desperate enough to do anything. But desperation is a double-edged sword. On Friday morning, I stood over my valve, wrench in hand, with 48 hours to decide if I was courageous enough to fight fire with fire. Delilah aimed to ruin my reputation, my business, and my right to live peacefully in my own community. She had transformed my grief into a weapon and my loss into a public spectacle. It was time to show her what real power looked like. I gave the valve one full turn counterclockwise and started my timer. The lake level began to drop instantly. In 24 hours, Delilah would awaken to a vastly different scene from her lakefront mansion. The game was on. Saturday morning broke with the kind of pristine, clear sky that makes one believe in divine retribution. By 6:00 a.m., my phone was vibrating like an agitated hornet's nest with the messages I had been anticipating for months. The first call was from Janet Henderson, my neighbor, who had offered quiet support throughout Delilah's tyrannical reign. Her voice was filled with the breathless excitement of someone witnessing a miracle disguised as a catastrophe. Jazz, you have to see what's happening at the lake, the water level. Jesus Christ, what did you do? By 7:00 a.m., I had my answer. The Resort Lake's water level had fallen by 4 feet overnight. The immaculate beach where Instagram models posed for engagement pictures now displayed 20 yards of exposed lakebed that reeked of primordial ooze and dead fish. The ornamental dock where $50,000 weddings took place extended futilely over mudflats that resembled the surface of an alien world. But the true spectacle was observing Delilah's morning run transform into a psychological collapse. All captured in high definition by my security cameras. She emerged at 7:15 a.m. in her high-end running attire, intending to complete her usual lakefront circuit past properties worth more than most people's entire retirement savings. Instead, she was met with an ecological disaster that would make property assessors despair and wedding planners contemplate drastic measures. The sound she uttered, a combination of a scream, a sob, and a primal cry of financial dread, reverberated across the barren lakebed like the mating call of a failing investment portfolio. She stood there for 8 minutes, gazing at the exposed dock pilings that jutted from the mud like the skeletal ribs of some ancient beast. Her ideal suburban world literally draining away before her very eyes. My phone rang incessantly all morning. Anxious homeowners, bewildered resort employees, and frantic wedding planners whose Saturday events were on the verge of becoming mud wrestling competitions. Each call was a minor triumph, a confirmation that my grandmother's hidden legacy was functioning precisely as intended. But Delilah's reaction was predictably desperate and characteristically malevolent. By noon, she had convened an emergency board meeting disguised as a community crisis response. Her strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Attribute the lake drainage to my terrorist sabotage, and use the crisis to justify immediate legal action that would permanently expel me from the community. The meeting agenda, leaked to me by Janet Rhee, the board secretary who had become my clandestine ally, read like a prosecutor's opening argument. Environmental terrorism by unstable resident, community safety measures, and emergency property seizure procedures. Delilah intended to portray me as an eco-terrorist who had destroyed the neighborhood's water supply out of grief-induced insanity. She had invited the county sheriff, supposedly for community safety, but in reality to arrest me. On trumped-up charges the moment I appeared. She had also reached out to 3 local television stations, planning to present herself as the courageous community leader, protecting innocent families from a dangerous madman. But here is what Delilah did not know. I had spent Friday night preparing for this very contingency. Rosa Martinez had supplied official county documents confirming my legal authority over the flood control infrastructure. Marcus Webb had drafted a thorough legal brief explaining easement rights in language simple enough for television news viewers. Tank Morrison had mobilized 50 supporters to attend the meeting, transforming Delilah's kangaroo court into a hostile audience that knew exactly who the real culprit was. Most importantly, Eleanor Pratt had spent the week compiling a presentation that would uncover 5 years of HOA corruption, illegal meetings, embezzled funds, and development kickbacks that made Delilah's character assassination attempt look like child's play. Sunday afternoon brought the vindication I had been waiting for. The resort management called an emergency meeting with county officials, demanding an immediate inquiry into the infrastructure failures that were costing them hundreds of thousands in canceled reservations. Wedding venues across 3 counties had blacklisted Willowbrook Resort after images of the drained lake went viral on social media. The financial pressure was working exactly as I had planned. Property values were already declining as potential buyers canceled home tours and current homeowners worried about their investments. The lake that had made everyone's property worth twice what they had paid was now a muddy crater that could be smelled from the main road. But Delilah's final move was sheer desperation masked as community leadership. On Monday morning, she filed a federal environmental protection complaint, alleging that I had illegally altered protected wetlands and destroyed critical wildlife habitat. The complaint sought immediate federal intervention to prevent further ecological damage by an unstable individual. She was attempting to frame my lawful exercise of easement rights as federal environmental crimes. If she succeeded, I would face years in prison and hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines. She was prepared to completely destroy me rather than concede defeat. It was time for the nuclear option. On Monday evening, I made calls to every television station, newspaper, and online publication within a 100-mile radius. By Tuesday morning, the media circus would descend upon Willowbrook Estates, and Delilah would learn what happens when you declare war on someone who controls the water. The emergency HOA meeting was set for Tuesday night. Perfect timing for a very public demonstration of who truly held the power in our little suburban paradise. Tuesday night, 7:00 p.m. The Willowbrook Estates clubhouse had not witnessed this level of excitement since the great mailbox placement dispute of 2019. 237 residents crammed into a room designed for perhaps half that number, creating a standing room-only environment typically reserved for championship fights or public hangings. Channel 7's news van was parked outside like a mechanical buzzard, with Rebecca Martinez and her team setting up cameras that would broadcast our neighborhood conflict to 3 counties. The sheriff's department had dispatched Deputy Williams, a sensible man who looked as though he would rather be anywhere else on the planet than mediating a suburban civil war. But the real show was watching Delilah realize that her meticulously planned public execution had transformed into a very public trial, with herself as the main defendant. She had organized the meeting with the intention of presenting me as an unstable terrorist who had sabotaged the community's infrastructure out of grief-fueled madness. Her PowerPoint presentation featured dramatic images of the drained lake, fabricated witness accounts of my threatening behavior, and a timeline of my supposed spiral into environmental extremism. What she had not anticipated was Marcus Webb standing at the back of the room with a briefcase full of legal documents, Rosa Martinez in the front row with county engineering maps, and Tank Morrison, flanked by 50 blue-collar workers who looked as if they had enjoyed their meal and were ready for the evening's entertainment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Delilah started, her voice laced with that kindergarten teacher sweetness that always preceded total psychological warfare. "We are here tonight to address the environmental terrorism that has devastated our community's most precious asset." The murmur that spread through the crowd was not the supportive rumble she had expected. Too many people had seen my Facebook posts, watched the news reports, and begun to connect the dots that painted a very different version of recent events. Mr. Crawford's illegal manipulation of our water systems poses a clear and present threat to property values, community safety, and environmental protection. She went on, clicking through slides that might have been persuasive if the audience hadn't spent the last 2 days learning the actual facts. That's when I rose and asked for permission to speak to the community. Deputy Williams gave a nod. He had reviewed the legal paperwork Marcus had provided and knew that no actual laws had been violated. "Thank you for letting me speak," I said, walking to the front of the room with the calm assurance that comes from holding all the trump cards. "I wish to address Mrs. Thornfield's concerns about environmental terrorism and illegal water manipulation." I produced my grandmother's 1962 correspondence with County Flood Control, holding the aged papers like sacred scriptures. These documents confirm my family's legal authority over manual flood control infrastructure, which predates this HOA by 37 years. The silence was so profound you could hear the air conditioning humming like a tense wire. "The county has verified my absolute legal right to operate this infrastructure for flood management purposes," I continued, gesturing toward Rosa Martinez, who stood to corroborate my statement with official county documents. In fact, Rosa announced, her engineering credentials lending weight to her every word, "Mr. Crawford is not only legally permitted to control the water flow, he is legally required to maintain the flood control systems on his property." But the true showstopper occurred when I took out my phone and called Rosa, who was standing just 20 feet away. The room watched in bewildered silence as she answered, then stepped outside toward my property. The clubhouse had large windows that overlooked the resort area. Through those windows, everyone could see Rosa at my valve location, live streaming on my phone's video feed, which was now displayed on the meeting room's projector screen. "This is a live demonstration of legally authorized flood control maintenance," I announced as Rosa's hands appeared on camera, gripping the valve handle. "Mrs. Thornfield has spent the last hour describing this as terrorism. Let's see what it actually looks like." Rosa gave the valve a quarter turn clockwise. Within minutes, water began to flow back toward the lake, visible through the clubhouse windows as the retention pond behind the building started to fill. The gasps and murmurs from the crowd sounded like a congregation witnessing a miracle performed by a very wrathful deity. "The valve is now returning to normal operation," I went on, watching Delilah's expression shift through confusion, rage, and sheer financial terror. "Lake levels will be restored to normal within 6 hours. No environmental damage, no terrorism. Just the lawful exercise of documented easement rights." Deputy Williams cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I have reviewed all the documentation. No laws have been broken. These appear to be legitimate property rights. It was at that moment that Eleanor Pratt stood up with her boxes of evidence detailing HOA corruption, and Janet Rhee announced her immediate resignation from the board, citing unethical conduct by the leadership. The room erupted into shouting, accusations, and demands for Delilah's resignation. 3 board members called for an immediate vote of no confidence. Representatives from the resort management in the back row looked as if they were mentally calculating lawsuit damages. Delilah tried to regain control, yelling about fraud and conspiracy, but her voice was lost in the clamor of 200 angry homeowners who had finally seen behind the facade of their suburban dictatorship. As she fled the meeting, screaming threats about destroying everyone, the room broke into applause that pursued her through the parking lot like audible karma. 6 months later, I was reading about Delilah Thornfield's sentencing in the county newspaper while Henrietta III pecked at my shoelaces. 18 months in a minimum security prison for embezzlement, fraud, and what the judge termed conspiracy to commit institutional harassment. Preston's development company had collapsed faster than a beach chair in a hurricane, taking their lakefront expansion plans with it. The new HOA board, elected with the highest voter turnout in Willowbrook's history, had nullified every action taken against me within their first week. They reimbursed my legal fees, paid double for the damages to my demolished coop, and issued a formal apology that now hangs, framed, in my kitchen next to Sarah's recipe for her renowned cornbread. But the real magic occurred when our small suburban conflict evolved into something beautiful. The Willowbrook Heritage Garden now sprawls across my 2 acres, a living history lesson that smells of fresh herbs and new beginnings. Historical displays showcase our area's agricultural past, featuring my grandmother's Depression-era photographs and stories of feeding families from this very land. The educational chicken coop I rebuilt with the help of neighborhood volunteers has become a popular destination for school groups learning that food originates from farms, not supermarkets. Local 4th graders visit monthly for lessons on sustainable agriculture and watershed management. Their teacher, Mrs. Patterson, always schedules their visits during the morning egg collection, and the sound of children's laughter mingling with the contented clucking of hens is more therapeutic than anything I've tried since Sarah's passing. Rosa Martinez, who has become much more than just my county engineering contact, helped designate the property as an official environmental education site. Our weekend watershed consultations have blossomed into something that makes my neighbor Janet grin, as if she personally invented romance. Sunday morning coffee over drainage maps has led to helping other communities combat HOA overreach before lawyers become necessary. Together, we established the Easement Education Fund, a scholarship program that assists rural landowners in researching their legal rights and safeguarding family land from predatory developers. The fund has already saved 4 families from losing their property to aggressive HOAs that used the same tactics Delilah employed against me. Our success stories read like a greatest hits collection of David versus Goliath triumphs. Margaret Chun kept her son's wheelchair van after we discovered ADA violations in her HOA's enforcement policies. Bill Rodriguez's vegetable garden was saved when we found that his deed included agricultural rights. 3 military veterans were able to keep their flagpoles after we informed them of federal protection laws that override HOA aesthetic rules. Every Memorial Day, Willowbrook holds the Heritage Festival, our annual celebration of farming history and environmental stewardship, which attracts families from 3 counties. Children gather warm eggs, while their parents exchange stories about resisting institutional bullies and defending what is most important. The festival raises funds for our scholarship program and fosters the kind of positive community bond that prompts newspaper editors to write feel-good pieces instead of crime reports. Last year, we raised $47,000 and helped 16 families avoid foreclosure due to HOA harassment. But my favorite moments still occur at every sunrise, standing on my back porch with a coffee that tastes of contentment, watching new generations of chickens peck peacefully in the same spot where my grandmother's hens resided 60 years ago, the scent of cedar shavings and morning dew, the sight of children walking to school who wave at Mr. Jazz and inquire about the day's egg count, the sound of water flowing correctly through systems that protect rather than threaten. Sarah would have loved to see our grief therapy chickens become stars of environmental education. She would have laughed at the irony of our worst nightmare transforming into our community's greatest achievement. Most importantly, she would have been proud that we had converted personal tragedy into a shield for other families engaged in similar struggles. The resort lake shines like liquid gold once more, but now, it is accompanied by a respect earned through the understanding that water, like power, flows to whoever controls its source. I am the honorary environmental steward for our entire watershed, a position that offers no salary but carries the kind of authority that makes future HOA boards think very carefully before harassing anyone about anything. Property values didn't just rebound. They soared. It turns out that having a nationally acclaimed environmental education site is far more valuable than having a tyrant running your HOA. Knowledge is power, but shared knowledge is community defense. Share your HOA nightmare story in the comments. You might be featured in our next episode. Subscribe to End for HOA and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story of ordinary people fighting back against suburban tyranny, because every bully needs to learn that sometimes the quiet guy with the chickens is the one who controls the water. That's it for today's dose of HOA madness. If watching justice get served made your day, press that like button, share your opinions below, and make sure you're subscribed. More unbelievable neighborhood conflicts are just on the horizon.